And now we move on to, I think, our last principle, which we've called distributism. And it's something we've, I think, perhaps talked about some scholars before, like Belloc and Chesterton and others have used this kind of language. And I think it comes from Leo, because he talks about distributive justice or distributive economy.
Yep.
In a way.
Yep. So I think Leo only uses the root word distribute twice in this document. But the term distributism comes from those two uses. And it really becomes a movement in the early 1900s, just 20 years later. And people like Belloc and Chesterton and others begin a movement which some would even call distributism, which is an ism.
Yeah,
you know?
it is an ism.
And we've said before, the church isn't in support of an ism and will never, because of the principle of subsidiarity, will never tell economies what to do. The church will provide principles and guidelines for how to act. But from there, it's freedom. Do whatever you want. And we mentioned that this is liberating. To give a set of ground rules, standards, but then to give freedom beyond that is a very liberating thing. So what we can't be doing is saying that distributism is an economic model like capitalism or socialism. It's not. It's one of many Catholic principles. And it should be taken into consideration, and because this is a doctrinal document, it's even binding.
Yeah.
But it's bound to us equally to the other principles that we've mentioned. And when we're making any economic decision as Catholics, we're not just being affected by one of these principles. We're being affected by a combination of all these principles. So that's enough about an introduction to the word distributism. All right. So Pope Leo has a quote that I would encourage every Catholic to memorize. And he says this. Let's see if I could remember it myself. The law should favor ownership and should induce as many people as possible to become owners.
Sounds right.
Okay? I think I got it. So the reason why it's important to memorize is because it should affect the way that we vote. It's not anti-American to think this way. It's not anti-anything. It's just a different way of thinking in regards to who owns what. What does Leo prefer? A society where very few people own property and the majority of the people are renting? Does he want the majority of business capital to be in just a few giant corporations?
No.
And everybody working for those
No.
giant corporations? So what is he saying? The law should favor ownership. So whatever legal structures that exist should encourage as many people as possible to own their house, not rent, to own the property that their house is on, not rent, to own their own means of production, not having to hire out their labor for a wage. That's what he's saying.
Yeah.
So what is he saying? He says the law should favor ownership and the law should induce as many people as possible to become owners. Let's say the amount of people who rented went way down in the United States and the amount of people who owned their property went up. Do you think that would increase the gap between rich and poor or decrease?
I think it would decrease the gap.
So this idea of distributism is the idea that less and less people are renters, more and more people are owners.
Yeah.
Less and less people are proletarians working, trading their labor for wages. More and more people are running their own operation, owning their own means of production.
Yeah.
So imagine a society with fewer large corporations, fewer proletarians, many more small business owners. Picture a society with less apartments, with people earning rent, more single-family households with people owning their own property, making those properties beautiful, living becomingly. That's distributism.
Right. Yeah, I think this might be very reductionist, but distributism in my head right now kind of is defined by that line, that the law should favor ownership or more people should own. It's kind of like with distributism. Yeah, it's like ownership should be distributed amongst as many people as possible. And it's not like the ism, it's not an ism like the others where it's like we're building this system. No, it's just this claim that more people should own because of the other principles on this list.
Distributism is the product of other principles that we've already mentioned.
And I think that the way I read Leo's use of distributism, I really do, I think, read it as almost like a tool, like this claim that the law should favor ownership or more people becoming owners is kind of the tool or thing that produces the fruits of these principles. So I think specifically he says, you asked if the gap would be bigger or smaller if more people owned, and we said smaller. And I think Leo says that himself. So to quote Leo, he says, if working people can be encouraged to look forward to obtaining a share in the land or ownership, the consequence will be that the gulf between vast wealth and sheer poverty will be bridged over, and the respective classes will be brought nearer to one another. And I think that's one of the fruits he mentions. And then he also mentions others, which I want to mention too. He also says that another consequence will result in the great abundance of the fruits of the earth. Men always work harder and more readily when they work on that which belongs to them. They learn to love the very soil that yields in response to the labor of their hands. Not only food to eat, but an abundance of good things for themselves and those that are dear to them. And I think that that's how you live becomingly, owning. And I think that these are fruits. Owning your property and the means of production make you love what you own and make you work harder. And I think that's why I think I read this as a tool, because he's saying these are the fruits of ownership. All the other principles kind of come from private property and ownership. And the more people that own, the better.
Amen. So now, all of a sudden, the primary principle makes sense. Because remember, telling a proletarian who has no way of advancing in the late 1800s that private property is a good thing, that's not helpful, Pope Leo, right? Until this idea of distributism comes in. If the laws change so that ownership is easier and even encouraged, then private property becomes possible. So that's one thing to mention here. Is distributism socialistic? Distributism is not an encouragement of the government distributing wealth through, for example, like a progressive tax system, which is essentially robbing the rich to give to the poor.
Like Robin Hood.
Like Robin Hood, right? Robin Hood's not a hero, according to Leo. Better than that is reshaping the laws. Remember, Leo was a lawyer, he was an economist. Changing the laws so that money and capital tends to flow to more people. Belloc complains in the early 1900s that the industrial system, the capitalistic system, broke an economy in England that saw in the history of the world the greatest distribution of land and wealth that ever existed. Now, I don't think that there's any way to prove that he was right. And not everything that Belloc says is true and good. There's plenty of things to criticize about what he says and his character, but it's an honest observation that he has, that the industrial and capitalistic system took people away from ownership. And what Leo is saying is we need to return not to the old system, but to a new system that encourages ownership. So distributism is not the government's redistribution of wealth. It's people being allowed and encouraged to acquire their own. Okay? And we think about the United States, its desire to get rid of the monarchy, to distribute political power. And it did so by having a couple hundred Congress people, 100 senators with 50 states, a whole bunch of jurors, administrative state, that fourth branch of government. And
biggest.
Yes, and most expensive. So in the United States, we've done such a good job of dividing power amidst the states and all the assemblies, all this stuff. But from an economic perspective, our antitrust laws still allow for as much of 80% of a giant industry to be dominated by like 4 companies. 4 is the magic number, according to Congress. The way that they're doing this when it comes to mergers and acquisitions. So that is an incredible amount of power for a sector like accounting or banking or food. Essential things like food. Such a small number of big competitors. So in distributism, what we would see is more banks. And there's probably 5,000 banks in the United States. So you probably see that 80% in the big 4 shifting to the other 5,000 more so, and even more banks existing. So more is better. And is there a lot of repetition in more? Yes. But that's not so bad for labor, necessarily.
Right. Yeah, I think that people are maybe starting to see that, or at least I've noticed that some people I know have started to recognize the issue of the lack of distribution in economic power. And we've talked about that in season 1. I think Leo's response almost feels a little maybe dissatisfying to some people because it's not forceful enough to say, you know, these laws must change or else, essentially.
Well, he's writing to the world.
Right. So it's almost a little dissatisfying because it's like, oh, the state can't do this. The state can't take away and redistribute. He's just encouraging people to do it. So, like, how is this ever going to happen? You know, it may seem impractical to some people.
Well, he does say that it should be the laws that are influenced by these principles to favor one thing over another, to encourage one thing over another.
Yeah, that is true. And I think it's just maybe might feel dissatisfying because an individual might feel a little helpless compared to, like, you know, we're talking about these ginormous corporations owning so much of the means of production. And, you know, one individual may be like, you know what, I'm inspired by this episode and I want to do this, but they must feel like helpless almost.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. So the encyclical is written to multiple audiences. If you look at the audience who's addressed, it's bishops. But of course, the assumption is that the bishops are giving this information to their people. So it's for everybody. Encyclical means circle, like everybody. There's multiple audiences here. There's governments that are being told, you know, what to do by Leo. There's individuals. And yeah, individuals may feel helpless. But one thing I would not do to a young man today is say, hey, Leo believes in distributism. He believes that you should be your own boss. You should own your own means of production. You should not be a proletarian who is selling your labor for wages. Because that's, according to the old way, like the definition of being in need, you know, rather poor. I would not recommend to that young man today to quit his job with a full-time salary and benefits and to start his own business, which has a 1 out of 10 chance of succeeding, right? As Catholics, we need to practice temperance and prudence and understand that our job is to thrive and to live becomingly for the sake of our families. And we have to work within the reality of today. Is the law right now favoring the small business owner to start from scratch, or is the law favoring a young man to work for a giant corporation so that they could receive a salary with benefits and some sense of security in regards to health insurance, income? Which one does the law favor right now?
The latter.
The law favors the person who is in the corporate system right now. So Leo would say, we don't want to intentionally discriminate against large companies. No, large companies should be able to exist. We would never have iPhones without a large company. So large companies are okay, but the law should be favoring the person who is trying to own his or her own means of production. And that person should not be struggling to, let's say, find health insurance. Like, there should be a system that makes it just as easy for that person to obtain health care. I'm not arguing for a single payer system there.
Yeah.
And also the taxes. There should be special tax incentives that make small business easier than, let's say, it would make it for a larger corporation.
Right. Yeah. And I appreciate your response, especially in the beginning where you talk about kind of like the need for temperance. And I think, you know, this is addressed to multiple audiences, and each one of us has this responsibility and call to do what he asks to our capacity. Like me as an individual, I cannot change the law, full stop. But the administrative state has more capacity to do that, and they are also bound, as if Catholic, to listen to this. And I'm going to do as much as I can and deduce and discern what Leo's asking me to do, and I appreciate that. And I think that's true. And these questions about the law and individuals, because sometimes, you know, even as an individual trying to do these things, sometimes you feel helpless anyway if you're doing as much as you can in your capacity. But I think so many topics come to mind about, you know, renting versus owning, and like the question that you said about small businesses versus big businesses. And I think that those questions are ones we hope to address also. Yeah, like in light of this, in later podcasts.
Yeah, we'll have a whole episode in the future on like housing and things like that. But you know, we're talking about two distributive elements: means of production and your labor and your work and all that, and then also your property, your living situation. So I think a very prudent stance to take in the economy of 21st century America, New Jersey. Most people are going to have no choice but to be a proletarian. You just got to suck it up and recognize that that's the reality, unless you're in a very privileged position. But what is possible is to probably own your own little estate. Mm-hmm. That's probably possible. So you save enough, you act sparingly, as Pope Leo would say. You purchase your little property, you improve upon it, and that's something that you could even pass down to the next generation. Mm-hmm. So that's possible. And it's becoming, by the way, less and less possible today. So there's inventory shortages, which is an issue, but the laws right now, are the laws favoring ownership or rentership?
Rentership.
Now, New Jersey is one of the kindest places for renters. Believe it or not, there's a lot of laws that protect renters compared to like late 1800s United States. But I'll tell you what the law isn't doing in New Jersey. It protects renters, but it's not encouraging ownership. And the state law and the national laws, they should be doing things to help people obtain property. And there are federal and state programs, right? But I think that the rate of ownership is getting worse, not better.
Yeah, and it's a shame. I think we've mentioned Chesterton and Belloc before, and I think that they expressed similar concern when they were writing to the one that you just expressed now. Mm-hmm. But it's not all dire. I think that we'll read some of their concerns in light of what you've said. And then I think Leo offers not another solution, but this sort of almost like a Band-Aid, like a thing to help that person that may feel helpless. Like, this is what you can do in the meantime while hopefully the law changes and other people feel this responsibility. Mm-hmm. So we'll start with Chesterton and Belloc.
Sure.
So, and this touches on an idea we briefly touched on before, which is that Leo assumes that when he's talking about the working class, he's also in a sense talking about the poor, like he calls them kind of synonymous. Mm-hmm. And I think that Chesterton and Belloc agree with him. So the Chesterton quote is, "The truth is that what we call capitalism ought to be called proletarianism. The point of it is not that some people have capital, but that most people only have wages because they do not have capital." Mm-hmm. Which we've, I think, mentioned throughout. And we say now the law does not favor the ownership of your home or the means of production. And so I think these quotes almost sound a little prophetic. You know, it got worse in a sense, maybe. And then Belloc's quote is, "The attitude of the proletariat towards property and towards that freedom which is alone obtainable through property is no longer an attitude of experience or of expectation. They think of themselves as wage earners. To increase the weekly stipend of the wage earner is an object which they vividly appreciate and pursue. To make them cease to be wage earners is an object that would seem to them entirely outside the realities of life." Which is a scary thought. He's kind of saying that people have, it's become the norm, like the natural thing to be this wage earner and to no longer be a wage earner, to follow this or to live these principles almost sounds fake. And you know, that's why I say some people may feel helpless.
Yeah, he's complaining about how people think.
Yeah.
In his time, he's complaining that people think that they will improve their situation if they just get paid more money.
Right.
So they're always going to be proletarians. They're always going to be trading labor for wages. They just want more wages, right? He thinks that that's crazy. So true wealth is owning your means of production and not being dependent on an employer for wages. That's what he thinks is best. So it's a different paradigm, different way of thinking of even what good is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that it's almost like a wake-up call. And I said prophetic because it feels like many people I know, or just many people in general, still feel this way. Mm-hmm. They are wage earners, and maybe they're owning a little estate, or they have their mortgage to pay, but they're still under this idea that, I'm a wage earner, this is never going to change. And they wouldn't even think of the word proletarian as being bad. Right. But they are proletarians, And, to be fair, we also, I and you are wage earners also.
Yeah.
But we try to be influenced by these principles as much as we can.
We could have influence without changing any laws here. Like, for example, when we decide to buy something, we could buy something from a small business or a larger one or a giant one. Like or a mega one, right? Yeah. So we should choose to, whenever we can, go small.
Right.
when we make a purchase.
Yeah.
We're going back to episode 1.
We are, yeah. And that'll come back later on, I think, too.
Yeah, yeah. And when we buy something, we want to make sure we're not buying something from anything that could potentially become a middleman that replaces all other middlemen. So we always want to make sure that it's not just who we're buying from, but how. We don't. If all products made by all companies somehow went through the filter of like one company and then came to us, and if we kept funding that one middleman, that one middleman could end up becoming an economic monarch.
Yeah.
And that's no good. So it's not just the producers, but the middlemen that we want to make sure we're distributing all of those things.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.